Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Don Perkins, A Champion's Life, by Richard Melzer. Narrated by Bill Andrew Quinn. Introduction. I distinctly remember the moment when this book began. I was attending a campus gathering in December 2018 when a former student dropped by my table and told me that her father was the great Dallas Cowboys fullback Don Perkins. Karen Walter asked if I'd like to meet her dad and consider writing a book about him. I was deep into another book project, but could not resist the temptation to meet a famous athlete and at least explore the possibility of writing his biography in the future. I was honored that Karen had even asked me to consider writing such a book. Based on some preliminary research, I had imagined writing the story of a nearly perfect life. I learned that Don Perkins had been raised in a small Midwestern city, had become an All-American football player at the University of New Mexico, and had become an All-Pro fullback for the Dallas Cowboys. He left the Cowboys in 1969, raised a family of 4 children, and had retired peacefully in the North Valley of Albuquerque. My proposed outline and its naive assumptions fell to pieces when I first interviewed Don Perkins in early 2019. Karen, her husband Bucky Walter, Don, and I sat around a table at Palmilla Senior Living, the retirement community in northwest Albuquerque where he was living at the time. Well prepared, I had a long list of questions to ask Don in this preliminary session. But just as I began to ask my first question, Don politely interrupted to declare, "I don't know who I am." I assumed Perkins was referring to the many phases of his life or his many careers, first as a football star and later as a sportscaster, community leader, and actor. Or he may have been referring to his gradual loss of memory, largely the result of injuries suffered as a ball player. Instead, as Don patiently explained, he has never known his true identity in life. Given his dark skin, there is no doubt that Don is black, but some blacks have assumed that Don had perfected his clear, baritone voice so he would not be identified as an African American, while some whites have assumed that he perfected his voice to be identified as a white man, although he was too dark to ever pass as one. Not knowing one's true identity would be difficult in any period, but especially at the height of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, when Don Perkins was most well known as an All-American and All-Pro football player. Another possibility was that Don did not know who he was because, based on his many talents, doors were always open for him rather than chosen by him when he might well have taken other options more to his liking. As I began to fathom Don's dilemma, I realized that a truthful book about his life would have to describe his childhood in one of the most segregated communities in Iowa, his experiences as a professional football player in the still segregated South, and the impact American racism has had on him and his family's life overall. His biography would also have to address other challenging issues in Perkins's complex life, including childhood poverty, interracial marriage, and Don's many injuries, including his dementia. And so my biography of Don Perkins became vastly different from what I had first imagined. It is the story of a unique individual who bravely survived when racial conflict and tragic turns might well have destroyed a lesser man, and who lived his life in a never-ending quest to find his true identity. Chapter 1. Childhood in Iowa, 1938 to 1956. Midwestern states like Iowa are still deep in winter in early March. On March 4, 1938, headlines in the Waterloo Courier announced that snow, sleet, and freezing rain covers Iowa state highways with hazards of ice. Driving was hazardous as overnight low temperatures dipped into the teens in much of the state. Other state, local, and national news crowded the Courier's pages that winter morning, but there was no mention of the birth of an African-American boy in a poor, segregated neighborhood of Waterloo. If news of this humble birth had appeared at the time, it might have read, "Born at 8:30 a.m. on March 4, 1938, to Claude Perkins Sr. and Joe Willie Joyce Childress Perkins, a baby boy named Donald Anthony Perkins. Young Perkins is the couple's fifth child since their marriage on September 26, 1929. Mr. Perkins is employed by the Rath Meatpacking Company, and Mrs. Perkins is a homemaker. The family resides at 827 Boise Street in Waterloo's Riverside Addition. Child of the Great Migration. Joining millions of African Americans that had gone before them, Claude and Joe Willie had arrived in Waterloo as part of the Great Migration of blacks determined to escape the flagrant racism, Jim Crow segregation, and brutal violence of the South. In the first half of the 20th century, an estimated 6 million men, women, and children had fled north, northeast, and west, much as thousands had traveled north on the Underground Railroad to escape slavery in the South prior to the Civil War. Frequently utilized 20th century overground routes included the Illinois Central Railroad with tracks to the Midwest, the Southern Pacific with tracks to the west, and the Atlantic coastline and the Seaboard Air Line with tracks to the northeast. Seeking paths to a decent income and social justice for themselves and their children, most black refugees migrated to large northern cities, especially Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, New York, and Philadelphia. Many other thousands fled to farmlands in the Midwest, coal mines in West Virginia, cities on the West Coast, and smaller industrial centers like Waterloo along the Cedar River in Black Hawk County, Iowa. Claude Perkins Sr. was one such refugee, driven from the South and lured to the North by the siren sound of opportunity. Claude's grandparents had been born into slavery in Louisiana, a state where conditions were considered among the worst in the antebellum South. Apparently, Claude's grandfather, Jasper W. Perkins, had gained his freedom with Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of January 1, 1863. Jasper served in the Civil War, enlisting at Port Hudson, Louisiana, on November 1, 1863. Port Hudson had been the scene of the longest siege, 48 days, in American military history. In their first major assault in the war, black troops had demonstrated their discipline and bravery as the Union Army fought for control of the Mississippi River. Their valor helped recruit additional former slaves into the Federal Army. Inspired, Jasper may well have enlisted as part of this recruitment campaign. Joining the 89th Regiment, United States Colored Infantry, Company A, Union, Private Jasper Perkins served at Port Hudson until the regiment was disbanded on July 28, 1864. It is likely that his service was limited to garrison duty. His name appears on a plaque among thousands of others at the African American Civil War Museum in Washington, D.C. Jasper Perkins and his wife Rhoda had 8 children, including James J. Perkins, born on August 10, 1864. According to the U.S. Census of 1870 and 1880, the Perkins family lived in Jackson, Louisiana. By the mid-1880s, the family had resettled in Freestone County, Texas, 100 miles southeast of Dallas. Son James married Anna Gardner in Freestone, Texas in 1886. Census records list James' occupation as a farm laborer or farmer. James and Anna had at least 7 children, including their next-to-youngest, Claude, born on November 23, 1908, in Waxahachie, Texas. According to family legend, Claude was a young adult when he committed the unforgivable offense of fighting a white man either in Waxahachie or in nearby Dallas. Claude knew that Southern blacks were forbidden to carry firearms, testify against whites, or raise a hand against whites, even in self-defense. Claude also knew that justice in Texas was dominated by white policemen, prosecutors, judges, juries, prison guards, and wardens in a system of entrenched white supremacy. With inadequate legal representation, accused blacks were inevitably found guilty in court and sentenced to long prison terms, plus fines and costs. With no savings to pay their fines or costs in prison, blacks worked to pay off these debts, plus interest, with what little they earned at hard labor. Even short sentences extended into years. Longer sentences became decades, with little or no legal recourse available. Labor on plantation prisons was so cruel and unusual that many prisoners died long before their sentences ended and their fines and costs were paid. Daily quotas for picking cotton were so unreasonably high that prisoners who could not keep up were punished with confinement in horrific solitary confinement for weeks and months at a time. Thousands resorted to amputating their fingers or feet or severing their Achilles tendons to avoid labor in prison or nearby fields. Almost 900 cases of self-mutilation were recorded in Texas prisons from 1932 to 1951. Of course, many black defendants never got to court, much less to prison. Vigilantes lynched an estimated 3,440 blacks as punishment for a long list of absurd offenses, from vagrancy and trying to vote to casual contact with a white woman or fighting a white man, Claude Perkins's crime. Rather than face a lynch mob or decades of hard labor in a Texas plantation prison, Claude fled from Texas, heading first to Canada and then to Minnesota. Learning of work in Waterloo, Iowa's Factory City, Claude relocated there in 1928 to seek a job at one of the city's major employers, the Rath meatpacking plant. Claude secured employment at the plant, working in the hog slaughter room. An estimated 85% of the workers in Rath's infamous kill room were Southern black migrants like Claude. Starting pay was about 35 cents an hour. Much like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which described horrid conditions in the meatpacking plants of Chicago, the killing floor at Rath had been described as a place where noise, stench, and heat filled the air. These nauseating working conditions led to frequent cuts, respiratory illnesses, and back injuries. According to one killing floor employee, until the late 1940s, the company and its foremen, much like plantation owners and their overseers, held the whip, making sure that employees worked constantly, not even allowing them to go to the restroom or to take breaks other than dinner. You were somewhat a slave because you either did it or found yourself unemployed in front of the plant. The history of blacks in Waterloo began with early waves of the Great Migration in the 1910s. The city's black population was 29 in 1910. By 1920, it was 400. By 1930, it was 1,234. Most black newcomers lived beyond the tracks on the east side of town in a section called Smoky Row. Don Perkins's mother, Jo Willie Childress, had been born on January 22, 1909, in Durant, Holmes County, Mississippi. She was the daughter of Joe Lee and Alice Lewis Childress, natives of Mississippi who had married in 1902. Locked into a life of cotton picking and inherently unfair sharecropping, the Childress family may well have followed family members or friends in a serial migration from Mississippi. A third of Waterloo's black population came from Mississippi, especially from Holmes County. While Claude Perkins worked for the Rath meatpacking plant, Joe Lee Childress secured employment at Waterloo's other large factory, the John Deere Manufacturing Company. The John Deere factory in Waterloo had opened in 1918, when blacks were hired in large numbers due to a severe shortage of labor during World War I. By 1920, blacks represented 47% of the plant's workforce. Much like at Rath, work in John Deere's foundry and mill rooms was described as hazardous and fatiguing, with extreme heat, excessive noise, poor lighting, and air filled with dirt, dust, and sand particles. Workers were driven by the intense pace of piecework. Job-related accidents and illnesses were common. Meanwhile, Alice Childress worked as a domestic housekeeper in private homes, as did 90% of all black female workers in Iowa by 1930. Although the Childresses never prospered and Waterloo had its share of poor working conditions, the family enjoyed a degree of economic opportunity they and their ancestors had never known or thought possible in the Deep South. Early childhood. Claude and Joe Willie raised 8 children, 5 boys and 3 girls. Dorothy Estelle was the eldest, followed by Gwendolyn, Claude Jr., Beverly, Donald Anthony, Paul Carey, William Clinton, and Ronald Columbus. It is not known who selected Donald Anthony's name or if he was named after anyone in particular among his parents, friends, or relatives. His own friends nicknamed him Perk years later. Don admired both his parents. At 6 feet 1 inches and 198 pounds, Claude Sr. was a large man with such a good sense of humor that he often shed tears when he laughed. Normally a peaceful man, Claude had at least 2 run-ins with the law during the late 1930s. In one incident, he was accused of hitting Nettie Smith, 31, with his car as she crossed a street in Waterloo. Although she suffered bruises and abrasions, the stricken woman recuperated at home. The Waterloo Courier did not report if Claude, identified simply as a Negro, was arrested and charged in the accident. In a second incident, an Iowa State patrolman arrested Claude on charges of driving while intoxicated on June 25, 1939. Found guilty in district court, Claude was sentenced to 6 months in jail. He appealed his case to the Iowa Supreme Court, but lost his appeal early the following year. There is no record of how many months Claude actually served, but if there was any good news about his sentence, it was that he served his time in Iowa rather than in Texas or any other southern state. Once released, Claude returned to his job in the Rath slaughterhouse. Joe Willie took control of his paycheck to assure he did not have money to buy drinks and that there would be enough money to cover the family's essential expenses. Although Claude spent most of his time at work, he sometimes found time to spend with his children, going fishing with Don, albeit never playing ball or other sports. Claude was determined to care for his family, a lesson he instilled in Don and all his sons and daughters. Preparing his children for productive lives was his highest priority. His clear message: don't waste time playing games if you hope to face reality and someday earn a good living. School was just a place you were legally obliged to attend until the time came when you were old enough to do what you were really meant to do in life: work. Based on his good work record at Rath, Claude probably hoped he could secure jobs at the plant for all his sons and some of his daughters, as many fathers at the factory did. Don's oldest brother Claude Jr. had followed this path briefly after graduating from high school in the early 1950s, as did Don's younger brother Paul in the early 1960s. Joining the military seemed like the only other alternative. Claude Jr. and Paul eventually took this route, and Don considered it, once saying, "After high school, I was ready to join the Army." Playing sports or staying in school any longer than you had to made no sense to Claude Sr. Get a real job and do it well. That's what Claude taught through words and deeds. Of course, Claude's thinking meant that he had no expectation that he or his children could rise above subservient jobs, giving them little hope for advancement on the job or in their lives. Don was very close to his mother, with many fond memories of her cooking, caring, and willingness to sacrifice for the family. Once when Don was a teenager, his mother, a small woman, was driving their car with him in the front passenger seat. Seeing trouble on the road ahead, Joe Willie flung her arm across Don's chest to protect him. There was no accident, but Don thought his mother's reaction was funny because she was so small, and by then he had grown to be so large. By attempting to protect Don, Joe Willie was reinforcing another important life lesson: I will always be there for my children. Neither of Don's parents was a strict disciplinarian. Neither resorted to beatings or whippings because their children knew what was expected of them without having to be reminded with any form of corporal punishment. The only time Claude hurt Don in any way was when he cut Don's hair with dull scissors. Claude used the same scissors on all his boys, meaning that they all suffered the same painful, unintended consequences. Don's family lived in a poor section of Waterloo on the west side of the Cedar River. While most black families lived on the east side of the river, the Perkinses were one of the only black families in a west side neighborhood known as the Riverview Addition. Don and his siblings didn't remember being poor, if only because no one else in their neighborhood was any better off than they were. Given their father's strict work ethic, all the children worked to help make ends meet. The children shared a newspaper route, scavenged junk from the town dump, and collected and sold old rags to make extra money. The family raised chicks, although about 200 perished in a fire caused by an overheated brooder stove in 1941. Don and his sister Beverly retrieved coal that dropped off passing trains, bringing it home in gunny sacks to help heat their family's poor insulated house. Accompanying truckloads of kids to surrounding cornfields, Don husked corn at harvest time, a job he enjoyed because he was largely on his own. The children had no allowance, although their mothers sometimes gave them spare change to buy candy, a treat for Don with his very sweet tooth. Considered grown by the time they were 11, Don and his brother Paul developed side hustles to access small change or goods. Paul played poker, and Don ironed clothes, including his own, which he made sure were well-washed and neatly pressed. The brothers dumpster dove and pilfered small items from grocery stores. Don grew up in a close-knit family. In Don's words, "We have always cared for each other." They enjoyed visiting extended family members, especially their cousins in Dallas and St. Paul. They celebrated Christmas, although their presents were usually practical items that they needed. There was no money for large, elaborate gifts. The Perkins' home was small, with only a bedroom for Don's parents and a second bedroom for the family's 8 children. Don often slept on the floor, although the floor had holes that were so large that rats ran through them and into the house. Don's favorite room was the kitchen, where his family often gathered and his mother made his favorite home-cooked meals, especially chicken, potatoes, and anything sweet. Without indoor plumbing, water had to be hauled home in buckets, and everyone made use of an outhouse in the backyard. Vulnerable to flooding, the Riverside addition suffered a particularly bad deluge in April 1951. Neighborhood streets lacked pavement, street lights, or sidewalks. Dogs were kept in the yard, less as pets and more as a poor man's alarm system. With little money, the Perkins family never thought of going to the movies, taking a vacation, or indulging in other expensive pastimes. The family owned a radio, but no television. Don remembered listening to the radio to follow his favorite heroes, Jackie Robinson, the first black player to win a great big league baseball, and Joe Louis, the black heavyweight champion of the world. With so many boys in the family, the children often played very physical games, including Punch-Out, in which each child would hit the other's shoulders to see who could withstand the most pain. Don's sister Beverly, a natural athlete, played this game with her brothers and sometimes won. Beverly also played football with her male siblings. She recalls a typically rough game when Don accidentally hit her lip with his head, causing an injury that required plastic surgery years later. Don was good at sports of all kinds, winning sandlot games, shooting marbles, and swimming from an early age. As he grew older, Don especially liked getting up early on summer mornings to go to a nearby gravel pit where enough water accumulated to allow him, his siblings, and friends to swim. With no supervision, it was a dangerous place to play, with several swimmers breaking their necks in diving accidents. A mysterious insect bit a swimmer in the forehead, causing fainting and illness. Public health officials never tested gravel pits for bacterial contamination. The risk of catching polio in stagnant water was real, but largely ignored. Don and Beverly witnessed a young man drown, despite the efforts of the local firemen who quickly arrived on the scene. Safe swimming places were segregated and closed to black kids like Don. Don's world was shattered on Tuesday, December 29, 1953. Jo Willie had had headaches for some time, although she had never been bedridden or incapacitated. On that gray Tuesday morning, she was visiting friends when she suddenly fell ill and was taken to Waterloo's Schweitz Memorial Hospital about 10:30 a.m. She died of a stroke an hour later. Jo Willie was 44 years old. Only 15 years old, Don was devastated by the news. Don was largely on his own after his mother's death. He felt especially alone when his father married I.C. May Austin on March 5, 1955, and moved into I.C. May's home at 305 Sumner Street in East Waterloo. Don did not get along with his stepmother, particularly when she insisted that he attend the Gospel Temple Church of God in Christ, not only on Sundays, but on days when Don had football practice or games. His father's opposition to Don's playing sports was reinforced by Icy May's opposition to anything that would keep him from activities at her nearby church. Don spent more and more time with his older brother Claude Jr. and at West High School. Waterloo education. Don had gone to West Side Waterloo schools because that was the school district where the Perkins family lived when Don first went to school. West Side schools were so predominantly white that not a single black student appeared on the pages of Wahawk, West High School's yearbook, for many years. In a telling image, the cover of the Wahawk's 1945 edition was colored in white, with figures of two white students dressed completely in white. Most teachers were white. In fact, it was not until 1952 that Lily Nina Williams Ferguson became the first black teacher in Waterloo and only the second black teacher in all of Iowa. Don was scared to death when he first went to school, although not by his fellow white students, many of whom he knew from his old neighborhood in the Riverside Addition. Instead, Don was intimidated when he saw paved streets, sidewalks, and indoor plumbing, conveniences he had never known in his poverty-stricken part of town. Starting in his elementary grades, Don walked to school, often with his siblings and friends. As he grew older, he had his first uncomfortable encounter with racism. In Don's words, "We got used to white kids saying, 'Hi, nigger,' this type of thing. But they were always little kids. I felt that it was done out of ignorance. But it is a little embarrassing when you are walking with a couple of your white buddies and a kid comes along and says, 'Hey, you're black,' or 'Hi, nigger,' and the kid probably doesn't mean anything by it. It may be all he's ever known." Don was especially conscious of such racism because his skin was so dark at a time when both whites and blacks consistently favored light-skinned blacks in schools, social relations, housings, the job market, the criminal justice system, and the workplace, including the military. White children went so far as to rub Don's arms to see whether your black skin would come off. Taunted by strangers and his own siblings as a little blackie, Don resorted to trying to bleach his particularly dark skin. Commercial creams like Sweet Georgia Brown's lightning-fast brightener were available in drugstores, but it is more likely that Don usually used less expensive homemade mixtures. One such concoction called for a combination of 1/3 water, 1/3 peroxide, and 1/3 lemon juice. Of course, nothing made a difference, physically, psychologically, or emotionally. They were just waiting to get me in a uniform. As with most boys his age, Don enjoyed two school-time activities in particular, recess and physical education. He was strong, ran fast, and excelled in games of agility, like dodgeball. After school, Don and his friends played football just because it was the thing to do. I didn't think I played it because I had hopes of becoming a high school, college, or pro player. I just played it because it was fun and all the other kids did too. It was not long before physical education teachers and coaches noticed that Don had all the talents of a potentially good football player. A sports writer later wrote that, as a boy, Perkins never really chose to play football. It chose him. Don said that by the time he entered the 8th grade, they were just waiting for me to get in the uniform. Race did not matter as long as Don excelled at sports. In fact, when Don's father married Icy May Austin and the couple moved to her home on the east side of Waterloo, the school board passed a rule that allowed students who attained senior status but moved to another part of town to finish at their original school if they desire, regardless of their residence. This decision, which might as well have been called the Don Perkins Rule, allowed Don to remain at West High for his senior year, rather than transfer to East High, a mostly segregated school closer to his father's new home. No other student fit in this category. Even Don's brother Paul, another fine athlete, had to transfer to East High because he was not entering his senior year when the Perkins family moved across the river to Sumner Street. By limiting the number of black students to one, the Don Perkins Rule was essentially a Jim Crow law, one of the last to be created after the U.S. Supreme Court desegregated public schools in its landmark case Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka in 1954. With Don playing as a senior for West High and Paul playing as a junior for East High, the brothers faced each other in Waterloo's intra-city rivalry in November 1955. The co-captain of his team...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?